The mission of Sustainable Tucson, as I try to remind folks each time, is to build an equitable community that thrives long into the future in harmony with our natural desert environment. Our theme this year has loosely been adaptation and resilience in the age of climate change. And certainly the topics we'll be learning about tonight will be definitely relevant to that. I want to make one quick announcement, and that is to remind everyone that on March 25th, Saturday morning from 10 to 12, Sustainable Tucson will be having a visioning workshop looking at the sustainable Tucson that we want to see by 2045. We're working with a university professor. You'll be working with groups of people on a collaging technique to create literally graphically a vision of that Tucson that you want to see. And if you are interested and have not yet done it, as a few of you have, please join us on the 25th at the Ward 6 office. And please go to the Sustainable Tucson website and register for that workshop. Are there any other major announcements at this point? I don't see any. Okay. If you could all mute, or actually Trace will be able to mute everyone except our speaker so that we don't have distracting background noises. And we are recording this, if you weren't here when that was announced. It's Pi Day today, and I really tried very hard to think of some ideas that would link pie to sustainability. It sustains us if we eat enough pie, I suppose. But rather than the P-I-E, pie, oh, someone's holding up. Is someone holding up your pie?
Yeah, this kind of pie. I don't know what pie you're talking about.
Well, it's P-I, the Greek letter pi.
Okay.
On March 14th is traditionally Pi Day. So if nothing else, it is an important time to remember science and the importance of good science. And that leads us very smoothly into
let me put the chicken
about our speaker. And we will, if we could have everyone
I'm going to mute everybody, then unmute the two of us.
Can you unmute us?
We're
okay.
Yes,
okay. So we're very excited today to have as our speaker Senator and Professor Priya Sundareshan. Priya was elected to the Arizona Senate in 2023 to represent Legislative District 18 here in Tucson. She currently sits on the Elections, Government, and Natural Resources, Energy, and Water committees. A native Tucsonan, she was born and raised in LD 18, and loves Tucson and the opportunities that she had for an excellent public education and opportunities to explore the outdoors. Senator Sundareshan also teaches natural resources law at the university. She's director of the Natural Resource Use and Management Clinic. And most recently, before that, was an attorney at the Environmental Defense Fund in Washington, D.C., where she advocated for sustainable federal fisheries management and worked in legal and policy issues. She's also a voting rights advocate, and she's led voter protection efforts and engagement on redistricting. She studied chemical engineering at MIT and then law and natural resource economics at the University of Arizona in a dual degree program in economics, law, and the environment. Senator Sundareshan knows we need more science-based decision-making in politics, especially when it comes to preserving our beautiful state for future generations. And as a mother of 2 small children, Priya wants her children and all children to inherit a sustainable world and a sustainable Arizona. As the ranking member of the Senate's Committee for Natural Resources, Energy, and Water, she's dealing directly with issues of vital importance to sustainable Tucson and our goal of a sustainable future. So we've asked her to start with an update on bills, good and bad, live and dead, dealing with those issues, as well as her role in that committee's work and where environmental protection currently stands in the state legislature. Then I'll have a few follow-up questions looking at some of the other important issues she's dealing with. And then finally, we'll open it up to questions. If you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat. And if it's something really urgent before we get to the open questions session, use the raise hand button on the reactions and we'll try to make sure to get your question answered. So with that, Senator Sundareshan, please take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Paula and Trace. That was a wonderful introduction. And it really, thank you for also mentioning that it is Pi Day, because I think my bio included that science-based decision-making that I wanted to come into office to promote. I did today on the Senate floor. I also mentioned that it was Pi Day, and I should have included that tie-in to that we should be seeing more science-based decision-making. But I think, the Earth is a sphere, and you can't calculate the circumference or area or volume of the Earth without pi. And I think so. Not only just the direct tie to science-based decision-making, which Pi Day reminds us of, but also when we think about celebrating Pi Day with eating circular things, the Earth is a sphere. So, get yourself an Earth-shaped cookie. Maybe we should start making that a trend. But yeah, so I'm new to the Senate. I was just elected this past year. So I took office in January, and it has been a whirlwind of a couple of months because right now we're in the middle of March. And so I took office. We started with committees and hearing bills in our House of Origin. So we had a number of weeks where we met in our committees and heard some of the bills that were introduced, and those progressed through committee, and then they progressed to the Senate floor. And at this point, we have voted on most of the bills that originated in the Senate, and now we're starting to hear the House bills and that have come over to us, and the Senate bills that were voted out have gone to the House to get their shot before they can then go to the governor to be signed into law. And where we are in terms of environmental progress is not very far, unfortunately, and that's because there are a number of us in the legislature who want to see progress on environmental issues, and we want to see progress on climate change, and that is a huge priority for us. And we have introduced a number of bills to do that, and also to address our water crisis. which is really starting to we're seeing the impacts of that already. And unfortunately, because those of us who want to make progress are in the minority, our bills are not able to be heard. And that does remind me that someone had asked before we started, how close is it in the legislature? In both houses, we are one off of a majority, right? So in the Senate, we are 16 to 14. So flipping one seat could make a huge difference in terms that could be a power share. In the House, it's 31 to 29. So in both of those houses, flipping just one seat could start to see some real change. But because we are in that divide, you see, it's very rarely that you see Democratic bills heard in committee. And so, I would love to talk about some of the bills that I have introduced personally that would address water issues, climate change issues, electric vehicles, and greenhouse gas emissions. I would love to talk about those bills, and then I can also talk about the bad stuff that we've actually been hearing that have been moving, and also kind of prognosis as to, you know, how far those are going to get. So I'll just, that's my roadmap, I guess, and then we'll see where those go. Sorry, my kids might, I don't know if you'll hearing, but they came home from the daycare, and so if they hear me talking, they might be crying. But so I'll try not to keep them crying too long. But anyway, so going back to that, so I you know, as my background shows, I'm a big environmentalist. I think that the state level is where we can make a lot of progress on environmental issues. We just have to have the political opportunity and the political will. We're close, we're not there. But because those are my interests and area of background, that is really a good deal of the bills that I've introduced. And so I'm just going to kind of talk about a few. So I do think that we need to have a huge focus on addressing the water crisis. And the problem with our water crisis is that we have some laws in place that should be protecting our water resources. And in particular, we have the 1980 Groundwater Management Act that was put in place in 1980 and has not been greatly updated since then. And when it was enacted in 1980, it was great. It was groundbreaking. It finally put in place some protections for our groundwater, but it also did not go far enough. It left in place a number of loopholes that are now coming to bite us later, because those have allowed for continued pumping and continued reduction in our aquifers. And so addressing water sustainability is a hugely important thing. And so, for example, what we need to be doing, and that this mirrors some of the bills that I've introduced, is we need to be expanding our management areas across the state. Currently, we only manage groundwater for certain areas of the state. The areas that had high population in 1980, we need to be managing groundwater everywhere in the state. We need to be talking about measuring groundwater. We don't know. We just don't even have data as to how much groundwater is being pumped across the state. And we've also been seeing in, you know, the recent years, some of the impacts of that, right? And, you know, I know we're all well aware of how there are areas across the state where individual homeowners are seeing their wells run dry because the groundwater the levels have dropped so much, that aquifer has been pumped so much, often because a big corporation or a big farm can just move in right next door and sink a deep well. And so they're sucking up water, and now the homeowner next door or the small farm or whoever it might be their well isn't able to tap the aquifer anymore. And so what we've seen though is that people are mobilizing, right? In this last election cycle, there was a ballot measure for Douglas within Cochise County, and they actually voted to create an active management area so that they could start regulating their own groundwater and have that groundwater managed. We also saw in December, the director of water resources at the state level declared that up in Mojave County, that aquifer was being overdrafted. And so he declared an irrigation non-expansion area to try to put some brakes on the amount of agricultural pumping. Both of those are just being put into place. It's the first time in decades that we've seen these new areas start to be regulated. But the growing pains as part of that is we're starting to see that as they set those up, they're required by the Department of Water Resources is required by their rules to charge individuals for regulating the groundwater. And so that could end up being a significant cost to people within those areas. So one of the bills that I've introduced is in an effort to really help put that kind of management in place. This bill would waive those fees for people as we're starting to put those regulations in place. So that's one example of a bill that would help support better management of our water across the state. Another big news story I know everyone was probably hearing a lot about over the last year was the story about the state lands that were being leased to the Saudi Arabian company that was then pumping groundwater. So they were leasing the state lands for fairly cheap, which is common amongst when you're leasing state lands. That's one issue we should fix is our public lands. Maybe we should be a little more protective and maybe charging higher fees for leasing those lands. But then on top of that, because those lands were not within any regulated groundwater management areas, they could then pump an unlimited amount of water for free, not pay anything for the water, and they could use that water for irrigation to grow alfalfa, to then ship overseas to feed their cows and their dairy industry. And so that's just all in all, it's just a horrific situation where here we are in Arizona, we have a water crisis. We should not be allowing our water to be pumped for free. And it's just, insult to injury that it's being then used to feed crops and sent over, grow crops that are then sent to feed an industry that's overseas. And so there are some efforts at the legislature, some bills that were introduced by Republicans. And honestly, I don't know if those even got hearings, but there were efforts at the legislature that would try to just one way to go at it is to ban foreign entities, foreign companies, or foreign individuals from leasing those state lands. And that might prevent the one situation in this particular story where it's all then being sent overseas. But that kind of approach also has, it has some constitutional issues because you're banning foreign companies from doing something, but you're not banning, you're treating people differently, right? So that there's a constitutional question there. But more fundamentally, from a sustainability perspective, it's not addressing the underlying problem, which is that we're not regulating our water. We're not being protective of our water. And we are allowing in these unregulated areas, any corporation can sink a well and pump as much water as they want and then use it for their own personal private benefit. And so, my bill would address the fundamental underlying problem, which is at least if you're going to be leasing state lands, if you're going to be pumping water out, then you need to pay a fee for the water that you're pumping. At least pay some sort of fee, and my bill would let the Department of Water Resources figure out what that number is. But at least let's pay for that water. So that was one bill that I had introduced. Both of my bills did not get heard in the Senate Natural Resources Committee, which means for most intents and purposes, they're not going anywhere. That said, potentially later on in the session,
I'm afraid Priya is frozen.
Okay.
There.
Priya, if you can hear us, we're not hearing you at all. Your screen seems to be frozen. Oh dear.
Would it help if we turn off our cameras?
I don't think that's the problem. I think it's her end. As she's gone off and presumably will come back on.
Let's hope. Oh dear. Okay. Barb, you have a comment or question?
I do. The reason they have a majority in the House and Senate is because they gerrymandered District 10, which is now District 17, when the Independent Redistricting Commission, which was not independent, changed our district into a massive district that, you know, included a huge Republican base in Marana and Oro Valley. And that is why we do not have a majority now.
Uh-huh. Yeah, 17 has been subject of a lot of controversy.
Yep. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
And Priya's back.
Priya's back.
I am back. I joined on my phone. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I think my internet is out for some reason.
Oh dear. These things happen.
Yeah, but I'm on my phone.
Okay,
Okay.
you're on.
Okay. So yeah, I guess I could, so the governor, thankfully, here's the, you know, we know that there's good news, which is that the governor is Governor Hobbs. And so, you know, from the Democratic perspective and from the sustainability perspective, she has much more of an interest in furthering progress on these issues than we previously had. And so, so in her budget, she actually included support for electrification, for vehicle electrification, and supporting charging infrastructure across the state, which is fantastic. And so I introduced some bills that my predecessors in the Senate, Senator Victoria Steele, had previously introduced to support electric vehicles. And so there's a number of bills that she had done which would you know, support a pilot program for electric vehicles, although I think probably the market has already gone far beyond pilot programs, and we can just go ahead and you know, implement a lot more. Making sure that the state, any state agencies, state resources, state vehicle fleets are transitioned to zero emission vehicles. And putting, you know, and implementing charging stations. So I have introduced those bills, and because that's a priority that the governor had listed in her budget, hopefully we are able to, once we stop the regular bills, we can move to budget discussions, and hopefully we can advocate for those making it into the final budget, which is a way of accomplishing good policy. And so having the governor be Governor Hobbs and having put that into her budget is a really good source of leverage to being able to achieve something there. So stay tuned for when for that happening. And so if you're interested in electric vehicles, maybe more than stay tuned, actually. Start advocating now across with your friends across the state, so that people who aren't just me are aware that this is a priority for people to be seeing in those budget discussions. So that's the electric vehicle piece. And then I'll just finally, let's see. Yeah, we talked about water. We talked about electric vehicles. I also submitted some bills working with the community choice folks from Tucson. I introduced a bill that would set up a community choice energy study committee, which is a study committee which would study the issue of allowing community choice energy and allowing cities and municipalities to be able to get into the energy business and be able to direct more energy from cleaner sources. And of course, the cost savings associated from that. There's also some repeals of state law. Apparently, there is a state statute. We currently are prohibited from setting up any kind of greenhouse gas emissions program. And so simply repealing that from state statute would be a huge win. So that's a bill that I've introduced. Also, within the last few years, there was a statute passed, a law passed at the state level that bans any city from being able to, ban or impact gas hookups in new developments, right? Because as we're pushing into electrification, we're recognizing that we need to really reduce or eliminate the use of methane gas, not only of course for the greenhouse gas emissions standpoint and the climate change impacts, but also there's also a lot of health impacts that have been shown from having natural gas stoves used in your home. There are a number of significant health impacts because of the fact that those gases are now inside your air that you're breathing inside your house. So trying to repeal that, which was just passed. Let's see, trying to think of anything else. I introduced a couple of bills about, I did introduce a resolution also that would encourage the Corporation Commission to adopt the energy rules that they had been considering. I don't know if folks are aware, the Corporation Commission had been considering new energy rules that would have updated the renewable energy standards for the state. It would have updated the renewable energy standards to much greater than the current standards were, which utilities have long since passed. And it would also have set storage standards and efficiency standards and put into place these incentives, and also required a certain amount of distributed energy, so that we're not just having the utilities go out and build a big solar farm out in in our desert landscapes. We want to also encourage the fact that we can put solar on our roofs and have a minimal impact to our undisturbed desert. So those are a whole bunch of bills and good ideas that I would love to have gotten forward in any way, shape, or form. But right now, because of the Republican majority, that didn't go anywhere. So, but let me also talk about some of the Republican bills that did make it through, or that are currently making their way through. We're not done yet. But for example, I sit on the government committee, and for some reason, I know you all know this, but there is this big right-wing paranoia about ESG and which is the environmental and social goals that and governance goals that companies might have as part of how they feel like they want to conduct business, and they want, in terms of investments, if this is a bank, they don't want to, they've used these environmental and social governance goals and criteria in terms of determining what might be a risky investment, because if you are investing in a project and it's not good for the environment, that creates its own risks as an investment. You want to invest in projects that also are thinking about, is there enough water to actually support the investment that there is being invested in? And so these ESG goals are actually good measures. They're good ways that the companies have of determining their risks and determining what they want, what kind of activities they want to participate in. But the right has now turned this into a big, the next scandal, the next paranoia. And so there are so many bills right now going after trying to prevent public entities, states and school boards, and anything from the state to down to the school board level, so counties, cities, from entering into contracts with any company that would have an ESG goal, which is ridiculous. And so they've had to water them down, because that means that the state could not do procurement from Target or something, right? Like there are massive corporations that have adopted these goals because it's simply good practice, good business practice. And so, so ESG, also they're attacking DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as again, these companies have adopted these good goals. And as the comment said, the federal government, the SEC, right, has started to adopt some of these criteria in the risk management and evaluation of these companies. And so this is a backlash against the way that companies are going and that the federal government is going. So that's one category of bills. Then there's the other category of bills that I'm seeing in the Natural Resources Committee that are anti-environmental. And Salil, who's my husband, reminded me that there's actually a good story out of this. One of these bills, the number is 1502, SB 1502, went through the Natural Resources Committee and passed, but on partisan lines. And what it would have done is it would have set into state statute a renewable portfolio standard, which sounds okay, except that renewable portfolio standard is the outdated renewable portfolio standard. So it would have codified in state statute the old renewable portfolio standard that our utilities have long since blown past. And then in addition, it would have said, and by the way, the Corporation Commission no longer has authority to increase those renewable portfolio standards, which, again, sets in stone these very old standards, and would have taken away authority from the Corporation Commission to further regulate, which has its own problems too when you're talking about taking away authority. So the good story on that one is that it went through the Natural Resources Committee in the Senate and passed on a partisan basis. And then when they brought it to the Senate floor, we were actually, this is a rare instance that, because when they bring, they're so in lockstep that when a bill comes to the Senate floor, it basically, there are so many of them you'll see that pass on a 16-14 basis, on a partisan basis. This bill actually failed. We were able to get a Republican senator or two to vote against this bill on the Senate floor. And so that was just miraculous. Of course, I will take credit for it because I had made a speech against it while we were voting. I think they did bring it back on reconsideration, unfortunately, and they probably made some promises to whichever Republican senator had voted against it that they would, either fix something with that bill or maybe, give him another, put one of the bills that he cared about on the agenda for getting a vote, some of the different nuances and negotiations that go on. But it was a very, very impressive and very, very exciting moment to just realize that that bill was actually failing and was not going to be going further in that moment. And then recently, we have been hearing some of the House bills from the Natural Resources Committee that got voted on in the House, so have made it all the way through the House, and now we're starting to see those House bills in the Senate. And so some of those that we're seeing, what we just saw in our committee last week, are dealing with these have energy impacts. They have public participation in our government impacts to that, because these two bills that we just heard would exempt certain transmission lines from having to get a certificate from environmental compliance from the line siting committee, which then has to be approved by the Corporation Commission. So it's part of this transmission siting process, and getting that certificate of environmental compliance is the only real way sometimes that the public has the ability to get a public hearing and participate in public comment and be able to even know that a transmission line is being built near them. And so there's two bills that just got heard in our Senate committee that would exempt either transmission lines that are just built on private property, which still have public impacts, especially if you're on a neighboring property, you're probably going to be impacted by it. It would exempt that from that process. And then there's another bill that would exempt some of the shorter tie-ins to the transmission lines. Although the way that they were describing it in committee was like, this would exempt the shorter tie-ins, which would help solar rooftop solar by removing them from the process. But when you actually read the bill, it's actually talking about lines that are up to a mile long, which is a very different story than when you're thinking about just your rooftop solar getting tied into the local transmission line. So anyway, so those are what we're talking about now. And but I'll stop there because I've been talking a lot, and I am sure there's some questions coming in. So tell me where we should go in terms of the discussion.
Well, I wanted to, a couple of the questions that came up, I will get back to shortly, but I wanted to ask one question for sure. Given your background and your concerns and issues, what made you decide that it was time to run for Senate, for state legislature?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it is it's a bit of timing and it's the bit of the passion. So, my interests are very much in energy, climate change, and environmental issues. That's where my career has taken me, and I have long realized that, and especially after my background, as you mentioned, was at Environmental Defense Fund. I was working in DC and I was advocating for Environmental Defense Fund. And in the 2018 year, I actually registered as a federal lobbyist. So I was advocating and specifically lobbying for environmental issues from the outside. And as my life and career has progressed, it's just become clearer and clearer that who is in charge matters, who gets elected matters. And so you can only hope from the outside that the person in that position is going to make the right votes. And so I was finally, when I came back to Tucson, and then the timing happened where I was advocating and working on voting rights issues as well. and then redistricting occurred, so which led to a number of retirements. And so there were these open positions, and it just made sense that, you know, we needed to continue to have environmental advocates from Tucson in the legislature. You know, Kirsten Engel, who is my colleague at the law school, and, you know, she's an environmental law professor herself. She was retiring from this legislature in order to run for Congress. And so, you know, I wanted to also continue in that vein to bring that expertise from Tucson. And then because of my other interests too in voting rights, you know, state legislatures are really where it's at in terms of the efforts to roll back voting rights or to promote voting rights. And so, so that was another reason why I wanted to run for the legislature, and where I could, you know, merge those two interests.
Well, we feel lucky that we've got you in there fighting for us, definitely. And
Thanks.
I will come back at the end to one final question that I've got. But one at this point, have you found that it's possible to do any work across the aisle? How does it feel to work with so many people of really strongly opposing positions, who are, especially ones that are blocking bills that you see as important, and your own bills?
Yeah. Yes. And it's a nuanced yes, right? The answer is sort of not yet. And we're starting to get there, and maybe we can, maybe we're finally getting to yes. And I think we'll get more and more to yes over the next couple of weeks. And the reason for that is, as you know, as we know, we've got a lot of, this legislature has just become even more extreme, because a lot of what were the moderate Republicans in the legislature were primaried this cycle. And so now you've got even more extreme people, you know, and when I'm talking, especially on the Republican side, it feels like even more extreme folks in those places. And so a lot of what I'm fighting back against is also, I know there, you know, when I joined back in, I know we were talking about LD 17, which is the neighboring district here. Senator Wadsack has a number of bills that are attacking the city of Tucson and the city and the charter city status, and how we run our elections. And so a lot of time is just spent kind of, you know, defending against those things. And it's pretty similar though across the board. So we haven't yet gotten to the point where my bills will go forward, but I will say we are starting to get to the point where the Senate chair of natural resources, you know, there are some specific water issues that she wants to deal with because we're running out of water. But the chair, as well as other senators, they want to be able to reassure businesses that Arizona is a place that can be invested in, and that those businesses that have been invited and enticed to come to the state don't suddenly realize that they were sold the promise of being able to do business here, and then now they're realizing that there's no water actually to do business in. And so there is some interesting discussions going on about how they can reassure the businesses not to flee, right? Or I don't know what, you know, but at least to help protect the fact that the businesses have come here, and we need to try to figure out how to make sure that there's water for them. But because water is so scarce, there's some interesting, the normal dividing lines aren't necessarily there. And so there has been an opportunity for me to start engaging in negotiations with them on potential amendments to their bills. So where the bill itself might be a very well, maybe not a very bad idea, but not a great idea, right? Because they're trying to save the businesses who have come here. I'm seeing an opportunity to, work with them on amendments that might actually provide a win for conservation, in the sense that we're talking about the kind of conservation measures that previously nobody has been willing to talk about. So ideas that might help actually, for the first time ever, require additional recharge into the aquifers, or require additional reporting of the kinds of industrial chemicals that are being used. So these are potential These are conversations that we're having about potentially, including these conservation measures into the bills that they really, really want to get passed. And so that's provided a little bit of the start of a ability to meet in the middle.
Great. We'll be keeping an eye out for hopefully some good news coming out of the legislature. I want to take a couple of questions that have come in here in the chat. One in particular was early on. Jennifer asked, how have the rules changes affected your ability to get important bills to the natural resources bills to the floor? And what can we do as citizens to bring support for those bills?
Yeah, I think the rules change Jennifer might be talking about is the one that the House Democrats were protesting against a couple weeks ago, in which they had their bills getting almost to the floor and then suddenly being told that they needed to get 16 Republicans to sign off on their bills if they wanted them to actually come up for a floor vote. I think that's the biggest rule change. There are other rule changes that have happened this year. For example, I think the biggest, the one that comes to mind, well, there was one rules change where they've said that they're going to destroy, records kept over a shorter timeline. So if you wanted to do a public records request, you have to do it pretty soon. Otherwise, after a few weeks, they they'll get rid of their emails and there won't be there anymore available for records requests. That hasn't impacted me yet, obviously. And then another one is that they created the new nominations committee to have one centralized committee that Governor Hobbs's appointments, her nominees to direct the various agencies, all have to go through one committee. And the difference there is that otherwise in the Natural Resources Committee, we would get to interview the people coming in to head up the Department of Environmental Quality, etc. But really going back to the one that made the news about the Democrats protesting the rule change about getting 16 Republicans in order for their bills to get to the floor, that has not impacted me at all, because on the Senate side, we do not hear that many Democratic bills, period. There's just very few that have even gotten a hearing in committee.
Okay. And in terms of what we can all do and to support some of these bills, Jana put a message in to get involved with request to speak, or RTS system, where you can go in and indicate either a thumbs up or a thumbs down for a bill that's in committee, or make comments. You can contact Jana at sustainabletucson.org if you want more information, or if you want to get on her environmental advocacy list. So that's in the chat with the email address. I'm going to just check.
And while you're checking that, I agree. That's a great way that you can help us, because when we're sitting in committee, we are pulling up the bills as the bills are being heard, and we're often checking, who has registered in for or against. And so, the more names we see against when it's a bad idea, And especially if also I can recognize a certain, I see names that I recognize that are, I know that's a constituent. That's really helpful.
Great. Let me just check some of these other new messages that have come in. There was, okay, here's a question. I think we've kind of covered your question, Stuart, but indicate if you still want to follow up on that. There was some discussion of who might be vulnerable legislators to focus on in the upcoming election. And I want to, remind everyone, Sustainable Tucson is nonpartisan because of our 501(c)(3) status. So we won't be directly engaging in those discussions, but there are lots of opportunities if you want to get involved with impacting the election results. Okay, we've got two people with hands up. Katie, why don't you unmute and ask your question?
Wonderful, thank you. My questions are related, which is, do you have any insights about how you think the budgeting process will unfold? And is there a possibility that more money might be allocated to address environmental issues, even though there hasn't necessarily been legislation that has passed? So, for example, the budget would come and it'd be Freedom Schools are funded and Pima Community College is underfunded. Are there some of those things that you think are, a possibility or ways we could support that to, maybe get more done in the budgeting process?
Yeah, that's a great question, Katie. Well, in terms of my insight, this is my first year as a legislator and my first year going through the budget process. So I'm definitely learning as we go, but I also do think that there is going to be that opportunity for better policy to be enacted within the budget than we are seeing through the bills process. And that's because one, we have to pass a budget before the legislature can end session. So nobody can go home really. And nobody can go home for the rest of the year until we pass a budget. We're not quite there yet. I think we need to see a lot more vetoes. So we're basically the Republicans in the legislature have not quite yet and only barely acknowledged that Governor Hobbs is Governor Hobbs. I mean, very often in the Senate floor, we're hearing them say, Katie Hobbs this, Katie, they're barely even recognizing that she is governor. But I think the more we start to see the vetoes come in of all of the extreme bills that they have been pushing through, the sooner we start seeing more vetoes, I think the sooner everybody will have to settle down to reality and realize that, okay, Republicans control the legislature, but the governor has the pen. And so if they want to pass a budget that is going to be signed by the governor, they are going to have to sit down and negotiate. They're going to have to take a look at the governor's budget that she submitted way back in January. And we're also, the other unfortunate thing is that we're in a reality where monetarily, last year there was a $5 billion surplus in the budget. And it's looking like this year that is far reduced. I'm not quite sure if we have a surplus, but in any case, there's a lot less available to work with. And also the Freedom Schools, the ESA's vouchers are projected to create a $400 million hole in the budget greater than they were previously budgeted for. So that's money that has to be accounted for coming from somewhere. And the governor's budget says, well, we're going to repeal those and get that $400 million back, and then we can allocate the money in all these other places. And that's obviously her opening bid. And so the Republicans are not crazy about that idea. They're probably not going to be willing to repeal the vouchers program, but maybe there's a place where we'll start to meet in the middle and say, okay, let's try to at least rein in those ESA expenses, the vouchers that we're handing out to anybody without accountability. Let's rein that in, try to put a cap on it perhaps, and then we'll be able to free up money for other priorities, including ones that the governor has, and hopefully the legislature, the Democrats in the legislature, we can be in that process of helping fight for the governor's priorities, as well as bringing it now back. So, not just the governor's priorities, but perhaps other priorities that would make a difference on environmental issues. So, the governor included in her budget electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which I think is something that I would like to really hold on to and make sure that what we fight for in the budget. I also think that we need to try to fight for some money to be able to get a better handle on our water situation. And in particular, money could be used to support the expansion and development of those new areas, regulated groundwater areas. Also, money that could help permanently retire some groundwater rights that could help stop creating that deficit for groundwater that we're creating. So things like that, it's all going to be very fluid, and once we get into that budget, with those budget talks, but hopefully we'll be able to negotiate and defend the governor's priorities, and hopefully sooner than later.
Thank you. And thank you for being such a wonderful representative for us here.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was really helpful information. VM Horowitz, how about if you unmute and ask your question?
I have like so many questions. I'm not even sure if you're my representative for where I live in Tucson, but I'm thinking about, and thank God Katie Hobbs is governor, because all these bad laws, she can just veto them and they're unlikely to pass. I'm wondering if you agree with that. I'm wondering about the possibility of getting ranked choice voting and the efforts to prevent ranked choice voting, getting ranked choice voting passed, and other and to some really bad laws were passed by the voters, not understanding this and what ways to maybe getting them undone, and some of the bad laws that have been passed getting undone. And I'm thinking about electrification, and maybe we have a problem in that we're making that we centralize our electricity and then send it out to the homes. What about making the utilities decentralized and use rooftop availability and the parking lot availability of creating electricity?
Yeah, that's a bunch of great questions. I'll dive in. I think I'll try to remember all of them. So first of all, absolutely, having Governor Hobbs is so crucial, because we know she's already said she's going to veto all of those bills that are being motivated by attacks on our LGBTQ community, our trans community, because we are seeing so many bills that are just going after drag shows and drag performers, and just trying to stigmatize, and there are pronouns, they're trying to prevent people in school staff from using the preferred pronouns of a kid in school. These are all just bills attacking our community. Thankfully, Katie Hobbs has said, you send me those, I will veto them. So what's great is that if we can hold together And in the Senate side, we have been very great at doing this. We see, you know, these extreme bills, and they only passed out on a partisan vote. It's 16 to 14. And so that sends us, I mean, obviously for the drag show bills, like that, Katie Hobbs is already aware and she won't sign those because that, you know, that's on top of her mind. Similarly, with a lot of the election denial bills, that's also something that Katie, you know, as Secretary of State, was very aware of the election denial aspects of what people were pushing, and so she won't be signing into law the more extreme bills that would restrict the right to vote. But what really does help is when the legislature can send that signal when we're voting like 16-14 on the Senate side, and hopefully the House is doing the same. If the bill gets to her desk and she sees that it was a complete partisan split, obviously this is an extreme bill that was not bipartisan, did not have negotiation between the parties, and that's an easy way for her to know that she needs to veto those. So yeah, it's fun. It's so great that we have her in the governor's chair. Ranked choice voting, I support ranked choice voting. I think that it would be a really great way for us to have more choices and to not feel like we're voting for a spoiler candidate because we really would love to vote for that person, but oh no, you know, that's going to take away votes from the actual maybe more consensus candidate. So I support ranked choice voting. Unfortunately, Republicans have latched onto it and they are pushing through bills that are against ranked choice voting. I don't know why, because it's not necessary. It's not currently authorized by law. It would still need to have authorization in statute in order to move forward, but they are preemptively just demonizing ranked choice voting to their own detriment, honestly, because if we had ranked choice voting, we would have had more consensus candidates running for governor instead of, so you know, they don't realize that we have a Democratic governor because we don't have ranked choice voting. They could have actually had Karen Taylor Robson been running, she might have won, right? It was only because Carrie Lake turned off so many moderate Republicans that we ended up with a Democratic governor. But anyway, I've said that many times to them. So if they can't recognize that, that's their fault. But yeah, I think, you know, they're doing a lot of things to attack the initiative process as well. I know that sometimes they're doing things to attack the initiative process, and then they're also sending things to the ballot for the voters statewide to vote on because they want to bypass the governor. And so it's this weird, you know, hypocrisy, right? Where they want the voters to directly vote on a lot of things, and then at the same time, they're also making it harder for the citizens' initiatives to make it onto the ballot. And so, yeah, there's just a lot of attacks generally on our processes. And of course, when you start to add 20 initiatives to the ballot, voters are going to get initiative fatigue. There's no way. It's going to be very difficult to keep all of these initiatives straight. And so it's going to be hard to pass anything good, because I think voters might want to reflexively just say no to everything, right? And so if you're going to try to put a good initiative onto the ballot, it's going to have to compete with all of the other initiatives out there. So yeah, it's a problem.
Well,
Okay.
the whole process of what's going to happen when all of these initiatives and referenda show up, we're going to really need to undertake a massive educational process so that people understand what's good, what's detrimental, what's restrictive of our rights, what should we support or oppose. So that'll come up.
Real briefly, are those initiatives going to be on the November ballot or this year?
No, we won't have, only the city of Tucson will have a November election in 2023. So all of these initiatives will be put on the 2024 ballot. And I think,
Yeah, Jana, how about unmuting and asking your question?
Hi, I'm Janice Siegel Stormont, and in addition to being on our environmental advocacy team, I'm also on the water committee. And one of the main things that we like to advocate for is water conservation, particularly with rainwater harvesting, gray water, that kind of thing. I was wondering if there's anything that you can do, even if it's not a bill, but behind the scenes where you could advocate for rainwater harvesting, or if you could maybe get some Republican to have some kind of incentives for rainwater harvesting, particularly in Phoenix, where they really could use some water conservation there.
yeah, absolutely. So I will say, here's something good that has already been passed by the legislature, and what we should be doing is maybe expanding it even more. But last year, the Democrats in the legislature successfully negotiated a $200 million water conservation grant fund to be administered by WIFA, the Water Infrastructure Financing Authority, which has made a lot of, I don't know if folks were paying attention, but it was in the news a lot in the last couple of months because they also have $1 billion to go find water from somewhere else in their augmentation authority. And so the big question is, where is that money going to go, and is there even water to be found? And so that was that was the Republican priority last year, was to put $1 billion into going to find water from somewhere else, maybe desalination. That's the proposal. But the good thing is that Democrats were able to successfully get $200 million into a conservation fund for grants, and that fund is going to start accepting applications soon, and that's really, I think, where we'll see the kind of real conservation benefits from things like expanding rainwater harvesting, expanding xeriscaping and turf removal, and more efficient irrigation, et cetera. All of those really important conservation tools that we have to reduce water use. There is $200 million in grant funding available over, I believe, the next couple of years. Yeah, so somewhere between 2024 to 26 is where those funds might need to be out the door by. So I would recommend, obviously with that kind of money, we want to be working with our cities and our counties to put together large programs, cities, counties, tribes, right? Even perhaps businesses and industrial locations, anything that you can really make a big impact.
Is there anything that we can do that you would recommend that our committee does to support that?
I would say pay attention, and I'm now as a I'm going to be now that I'm in the Senate, I will be a legislator sitting on the WIFA board. So I would just say pay attention to what that agency and the board is doing. Not just because I think the attention that was put onto WIFA also successfully got that desalination project, put the brakes on that project before they were able to commit a significant amount of money to a project that might not go anywhere. So that the public attention that it received was good in that respect. And so yeah, pay attention to that agency, advocate for, really responsible use of the funds, and And then also just let folks that who might be able to put that money to good use, let them know that that fund is available and that they should apply.
Can you give us a heads up? Can Janet at sustainabletucson.org and give me a heads up? I can send it out to my advocacy email list as well as to my water committee.
I can try. I don't know. I'll have to see what the rules are of sitting on the board and doing that, but also the WIFA website might should be publicly kind of available to watch.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. And I want to follow up on a comment that Jennifer put here in the chat that relates to all of this. She said, we need to push the HOAs to adopt water conservation. She notes that it's against the rules of her HOA to water harvest where she lives. And I think in the same way that it was a regulation put in place through the legislature that HOAs could not forbid people from putting solar on their roofs. This was a while back, quite a while back. Maybe it's time to have some sort of regulation that HOAs cannot refuse to allow people to do water harvesting or xeriscaping, if that might become an issue. So that's just a little, bug in your ear to think about as new legislation gets prepared for next season.
Sure, and I think somewhat similarly, I think there might already be a law that HOAs cannot, or maybe this is one that went through committee this year, but in any case, HOAs cannot ban the use of artificial grass in case people want to put in artificial grass. They're not allowed to ban that. Obviously, I think xeriscaping is the better form of that, but yeah, definitely take a look.
Great, okay. And then for folks' information, so there's an HOA water conservation grant available in Tucson now, but I'm not sure that would be available to HOAs out in the residents out in the county. So something to think about. And we have a new visitor. Great.
Yeah. This is my 1-year-old.
Well, okay. Janet, is your hand up again?
No, I'll take it down.
No, that's okay.
I was waving at the kid.
Oh, okay. Welcome. Okay. I think unless I see other questions cropping up or our hands raised, there's a lot of appreciation for the hard work that you're doing in the legislature. And
thank you.
I'll finish with maybe, B.M. Horowitz, you've got a question there? If you could unmute.
You thought of ways like Congress changed the law when the senators were and the Congress people in the middle, like they were forced to spend time together, and so there was less of this incredible acrimony and more respect for people as people. And I'm wondering if you thought of ways to create that in your legislature to like meet people and people maybe you can sway some common ground.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's both yes and no. So I'm part of a group of bipartisan legislators that it's actually called this Common Sense Leaders Group to try to bring together people from both parties to talk and meet and have that space where we can connect on and find the shared values. So there's definitely an effort to try to do that as much as possible. But the problem too is that it's part of the disconnect as well, or what is kind of weird is that in the committee room, you know, when I'm especially in the more contentious committee like elections or government, you know, even when we show up, we sit at the dais and we're generally kind of polite to each other, but then you know, the very bad and sometimes even horrific policy that is being pushed is, it's just so, there's this weird disconnect where you're like, you see this person sitting across the table from you and, you know, they're smiling and they're nice, but then on the other hand, they're pushing a bill that is, you know, targeting young children or targeting trans children and or targeting or saying, you know, saying things about ESG goals that are just false. And so the answer is yes, but to a limit. You know, there's not, you know, we can't get too far when there's just not a common basis even of reality or facts to work from.
Right. Okay, well, clearly it's getting to be time to wrap things up. I do want to ask one more question, and hopefully it will be one that will be easy to answer. We talked a bit about requests to speak, but clearly the question is, what can we do? What kinds of actions would be the most helpful to you and on these issues? And you know, what would you like to leave us with in terms of a call to action?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of different types of types of actions I can call you to do in the kind of shorter time frame and the longer term time frame. And the shorter time frame is, yes, absolutely, request to speak, register your, you know, contact Jana to get registered, and you know, so that we know on each particular bill that people are watching and know that this is something that we shouldn't just, you know, let slide by in the night. So that's the first one. And the second one too is for the particularly bad bills, if you are able to come in person and testify in the committee about it, that would be even more fantastic. Well, that's also fantastic because it does show again that people are watching and have an opinion and want that opinion to be reflected in the votes that we take. And in particular on these sustainability issues, you know, you tend to get people testifying who are, you know, lobbyists for various groups, but we don't necessarily get a lot of testifying from the pro-environment side. You know, Sandy Barr from the Sierra Club is often testifying, but she's generally, you know, the lone voice when testifying on some of these bills. So it's great if you can come. The Senate Natural Resources Committee meets Thursday mornings, generally at 9:30. So if you're able to make it, that's great. They don't have a remote testifying option anymore now. They did during the height of the pandemic, but it's now just in person, unfortunately. So it doesn't really help for our Tucson members unless you're able to really take, you know, the journey up. And then more longer term, I would definitely circle back to what I've saw in the chat. You know, we need to elect leaders who see that sustainability is important, that we need to address the climate crisis, and that does, yeah, no Zoom options, sorry, not for testifying in committee. But yeah, the longer term is that we need to elect more people who will, who recognize the climate and water crises for what they are. And so yeah, focusing on helping us flip the legislature so that we have the majority and can actually push good policy.
Okay, well, I know certainly for Sustainable Tucson, we'll be getting the word out as much as possible and trying to work on these things. And as I said, there are lots of thanks to you in the chat, and really great appreciation for everything that we learned tonight. It was a crash course in what's going on in at least part of our state legislature that really impacts issues that we find very important and very relevant to us. So I want to thank you so much. I should express some appreciation to your husband for taking care of the kids while you were busy here with us. You can thank him.
Oh, absolutely.
Express our thanks. This is really wonderful, and we will be doing as much as we can to try and support you and support these important bills that you're working on. So
Thanks so much.
Thank you everyone for attending, and we will be keeping up. Next month, second Tuesday, our program will focus on, it'll be kind of an Earth Day special. We're going to try and bring in some of the voices of young people advocating for sustainability. And I will remind you all again that on March 25th, you can sign up on the Sustainable Tucson website to participate in our visioning workshop, to share your vision of what you want for Tucson in 2045.